Hey everybody, thanks for joining today. This is Brad, and I thought this would be just a really interesting opportunity to break from the regular update videos and blogs and actually dig into some of the ins and outs of my process and what I do and how I do it and with which tools. Um, this video is not intended to be too long or too drawn out. I hope to have more detailed videos in the future for those who are interested in particular areas. Today, I just want to go through some of the general tools that I use, how I use them, etc. So I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm by day, I'm a cloud architect, working up in the Microsoft Azure cloud every day, and loving that. But I was really looking for an opportunity to work on client software, game software. I have a background originally in C++ and C# development. And I was really looking for a way to sort of break back in after about a 10-year hiatus. So I was really looking for an opportunity while not trying to get rich at the same time, because the fact of the matter is game dev is not always lucrative. Um, so, so I started to move through some different ideas and came up with this idea of remaking one of my favorite games of all time. In fact, probably the very first RPG that I ever played, and it was obviously very memorable to me. Although at the age that I originally played it, there's no way that I possibly could have beaten it because it was way too difficult for someone who's younger than 10, let's say. Um, so I'm going to take you through a few of the most important components. The first one being the core library, as I call it, or which is actually labeled Ultima 5 Redux, which is the headless, GUI-less component that actually contains all the game logic. It has all the logic for reading from the original files and saving to disk, and actually takes on a lot of that logic, something as simple as moving an NPC around the screen. And then, the second half is that 3D component, which is the Unity game engine component, which I've tried to call back to be just the bare bones. So I'm going to first take you through um, Unity here. So when I open up, you'll see I'm using 2019.3. I try to stay relatively up to date, but anybody who's a Unity developer almost certainly knows that when you upgrade, things break. So it's a bit of an event, and I only do it every couple of months because things do break. It is a bit of a pig to boot up, I must say. But early on when I was looking at different game engines, there was three big players, right? There was Unity, which is the number one game engine, but largely because of the mobile stores and mobile gaming, but also, and it has that Unity look, if you know what I mean. The second one is Unreal Engine 4, which is based on C++. I had already started development on my C# code earlier than I had picked the game engine, because I actually wrote everything headless for quite a while because graphics really needed to be the secondary focus. And the third engine was Godot. And at the time, I read that the C# um, support was a little bit spotty. If I could go back in time, it would definitely have been a contender. And I've often thought about um, rebuilding the front end in Godot, but I'm this far along. I don't want this project to go on for the next 10 years. So here we have our a Unity space. Um, I am not a Unity developer. I'm a C# developer, and I'm just kind of making the Unity work, to be honest. Today, I'm not going to go through all the nitty gritty today because I want to show off some of these tools, but I will tell you a couple of interesting highlights. I'm using a preview feature, the high definition rendering pipeline, and that's because of some limitations in the lighting. Makes it a lot heavier, but and way more complicated to get lighting and all that. And I'm really just hobbling my way through it if I'm going to be square with you. The interesting thing here is for anybody, it's just as simple as hitting play. It's going to pull up my latest save file, and then there we are. I'm in Cove, whatever save file that was, of which I have many, and I'm going to go into those in a bit later. So I'll go on just to a couple of the IDEs. Now, when it comes to C Sharp, the default is Visual Studio. Um, a lot of folks are using Visual Studio Code. I really tried it. When I'm working my day job and I'm writing up Bash scripts or Python or whatever I'm putting together, then Visual Studio Code is completely suitable for me. When I'm doing a project of this size and scale, I find it is a little complicated and the debugger is lacking. And for me, debugging is critical. So originally I had built everything in Visual Studio, um, and that was fine. And then Reddit keeps popping up these ads about JetBrains Rider. And now that's a paid product, but if you have a project that's been open source project and you're making no money off of it through sponsorship, then you are able to you get a free copy. And so I did that, and that's what we're seeing here. So I would actually write everything in Rider because I actually prefer Rider, having gotten through that because of some things like the ReSharper, which is a refactoring library that I use. Um, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Either way, I use for the 3D component and the integration into Unity, I use Visual Studio, and for my core code, I use Rider, and that suits me just fine. And as you can see here, you're able to attach a debugger, etc. And I do that often. But again, Rider for me is definitely the superior product, and the refactoring. So don't pretend that you know what you're gonna, what things are gonna look like in a year. So the ability to be able to refactor your code is wonderful. Now, early on, and especially coming from an enterprise background, I appreciate and respect the need for source control. Coming up from the old days of CBS and Visual Source Safe and SVN, and now into Git, which I think is definitely the superior product. I signed up for a free account on GitHub. It's free open source software, so it's no problem. It's not enterprise. And so there we are. That's where I keep my repositories: one public, one private. Again, so the main code, which everybody has access to review, and then the 3D Unity component side of the code. I use lots of different features of GitHub. It's not just the Git repository, which is of course wonderful. Um, I also have started to use the projects. So when I track all of my work, I track it through GitHub project. So you can see here's the latest sprint. There's some work that I was working on previous to that. And it's a great way to track your work if you use agile methods for development, or if you're really into Kanban, etc. It's a wonderful tool to use. And I've also been working and with some folks in the community as well. Cambergall, if I'm saying that right, who has been helping troubleshoot some issues. And so that way, when the product gets a bit more mature and it's ready for things like bug reporting, when we enter sort of the alpha and beta stage, it's going to be great to be able to have issues um, uh, addressed through this sort of single interface. And dare I say, although don't quote me on it, one day I might open it up for contributors as well. Although for anybody who's ever asked me, and there's been a few, um, I'm I'm I keep it pretty close to my chest because I'm a bit worried about it getting away. And for me, this project has been it's a passion project, and I never want to make it feel like work. And I there's management components of my job at work, and I really just kind of want to focus and be singly focused. Um, when I work on my project. So, and I also have been tracking features, right? So we have this interesting workflow here where anybody can propose a feature, and then I would review it, and then I would either approve it or deny it, reject it. So, and here's some examples where Cambergall who put some of these great screenshots together for me to really illustrate his point, and he wants some extensibility. So I just pushed it back and said, oh, can you actually, um, just define that more specifically, so anyway, we use that, and then here's the fat client for it, the GitHub desktop tool that I use for my Unity project, because at the time Unity didn't have, or at least I didn't like, the native integration. So I use the GitHub desktop, and when I'm in Rider, I do everything natively directly in Rider for my commits and etc. So that's my source control. And here's just a fun one. This kind of went nowhere, but I also plugged it all into Slack. And so every time I commit, it comes up in Slack. And every time I'm on Twitter, it comes up in Slack. For me, I like to use this project as a way to test new technologies. When I'm at work in an enterprise, some things are sort of thrust upon you, and you don't necessarily get to choose the latest, coolest, newest um, tool or operating system or whatever it happens to be. So I tend to spread my wings on this and use a lot of preview features, a lot of beta stuff, because why not? All right, so next up is the voxel component. Um, when I first was digging into voxels, um, I had a lot of questions, right? Is this thing its own format? Is it how do you make these things? Is it all paid software? Is there free and open source? Why would I do one over the other? How on earth do I get this thing into Unity? Is it optimized? So in Unity, um, I use it's called the voxel importer, and it's the only paid component of Unity that I use, and which is the reason I'm not able to publish the Unity um, source code component. I'm hoping to eventually get away from that, but for me, it was just too easy, and I really needed to. Now, the software that I use for making voxels is called Magica Voxel, and it's free. I don't know if it's open source or not. I really haven't gotten into it, but it is super sharp, relatively straightforward once you get the hang of it. Um, and it really makes taking the 2D image and converting it into a 3D image easy enough. Um, you can't just slap it in. You really have to design for it. And you can even see as you get closer and closer all these little imperfections, and that's just the nature of it. It also has a rendering engine, which I don't need to use. But essentially, here's all of the files, right? So if I wanted to go look at, there he is climbing the ladder upwards, right? Um, you know, just about every single of one of the 512 sprites has been captured, um, one by one by one, into this program, and then I build them out. So for example, I can attach um, some extra dots to them. I of course wouldn't do that, but there you go. So Anyway, I use this program, and then I export directly into this voxel format, this native format, and then it gets consumed into Unity, and it builds an optimized mesh for me into a 3D object, which is the stuff that I don't even want to touch, which is why I'm so happy to have a third-party product that does it for me. Okay, so now we have the IDE, the game engine. We know how the graphics are generally created. But what about all of that code, that old code, the original code um, that we need to pull in? Because if you've been following the blog, you know that there's a lot of data ingested from the original sources, OVL files and DAT files and GAM, the save game file, and all of that. So the place that I started is hallelujah to the Ultimate Codex. Um, there were a whole bunch of guys, Nautilus Dragon amongst others, um, and years ago they started to reverse engineer the save game formats, the data formats, and it's not complete, but it's pretty darn good and it's pretty darn close, right? So and the Ultima Codex, for all those Super Ultima fans, you know that literally if it's an Ultima thing, then it's recorded there one way or the other. So there's this Ultima 5 internal format that I use as my reference. And I've added to it as I discover new things, but the vast majority existed ahead of time, right? How do you read the graphic formats? What do what's the format of the files from the point of view of the binary breakdown or the byte breakdown, excuse me. It was really, really wonderful because it gave me so much information all the way down to, here's the save game format, right? And it tells you exactly what's in your inventory, etc. So you take that and now you actually have to be able to read it. So I use another free piece of software called HXD. Um, and let's pull open one that I read all the time, the data OVL, right? So through this, I can compare, a record, um, let's say the shard names I saw, spell names, that'll do. Right? So here's the offset, right? So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go to 709, and what do you have? There you go. There's all the spell names. And then what I do in my software is I basically pull them in directly. And that was one of the goals early on in the software development, was that I would be pulling in as much original data as possible. And there's been times where I've had to deviate, but generally speaking, it's original data. And for folks like Sir John and Cambergall, there's an interest in extending it, or in Sir John's case, doing German translation. And I believe I've built it in a way that when the time comes, that those translations can occur, and we should be able to make translation tables regardless of the original data as well. So there is that, and then there's also Dino, who I thank for all of his help, and he has ample um, resources, all the way down to some of the stuff that I would have used early on, um, around some of the maps. Um, I'm trying to find it here. Anyway, there's some really old raw save game information that people were, formatting, etc. So it's been really, really helpful. And actually, Dino was the first one of anybody in the community to reach out to me. And then that's sort of where I was introduced to the Ultima Dragons sort of community. and I must say it's really been wonderful. So yeah, so I use this. That's pretty good. There's another software program that I've been using, O10 Editor. I'm not going to launch it because I think I can only use it 3 more times until I need to license it. But I use it when I'm diffing two files together, and that's a really great way to try to figure out what's different, say between you go into the game and you take one turn and then you save that result and then you compare it and it helps you see what changes in the save file um, between steps. Anyway, so that's been really helpful. But the majority of the time I spend in HXD, excuse me. Uh, so if you see a pattern, I like to use free software, um, and this is no exception. Okay, so another super duper, probably one of the most important pieces of software that I use, and I suspect a lot of you folks do too, is DOSBox. So you'll see here as I launch DOSBox, which is a DOS emulator, and of course there is no Windows port of Ultima 5, um, so so it runs in DOS. And even then, just because of the way it's clocked, if it ever did get a direct port, it would just go. It needs to be downclocked. It would just run a million miles an hour. Um, so as you can see here, I have a U drive where I have my Ultima 5 and then my V, which is Ultima 5 Late. This is a save game that I found on the internet, a really late game. So it's really cool because it lets me test late game stuff. And then the U is the more generic. And then N is my own game that I'm actually actively playing because part of this process has to be re-remembering all those finer components of the Ultima series or Ultima 5, excuse me. So let's go to our V drive to start. I have a whole selection of um, preset areas. So, my go-to is Britain. Uh, and I'm going to tell you, there's a good chance I'm probably not even in Britain. I bet you I'm in Minot, and we're going to see. Yeah. So, so I'm in Minot. I was doing some testing of multiple moon gates, and I didn't use that in my last video, but this is where I was testing the behaviors of, well, what happens when you search for a moon gate or a moonstone under a moon gate while the moon gate's active, for example, right? Or um, can you move when the moon gate is moving? And the answer is yes. So, anywho, this is a wonderful program, obviously, and basically what I do is I make many copies of the entire install and save directories. But in today's world, that's like nothing at all. So that's another one of my most favorite and most important software tools that I use. Okay, and I walked right past another product that I use, uh, Aspirite, and now this is not free and open source. This is a paid product, but sometimes the free and open source softwares they just don't do what you need, and that's okay. But I do tend to start with them. So I used Paint 3D amongst other tools when generating some of the sprites. But I just found I needed a tool that understood what what pixel art was, and had some specialization around that and palettes and etc. So here's an example where I had just made some moons. So this was all from scratch with some blurring. And then there's this really cool layering tool, right, where I layer this black on top to make all the different moons so that I can keep the exact same shape. Um, so anyway, this has been a really sort of wonderful tool, and I hope to use it more. For anybody who's looking at, sort of not the art style of Ultima 5 Redux, but the art itself. The I have this sort of hard and fast rule where I don't like to get too bogged down on any one thing for too long. So I focus on game logic primarily. I put in sprites and voxels that look good enough, and my real hope is that one day that I circle back and maybe with some help from people who are experts in this area, and we can really, really nail them down and make them look great. Because as much as I appreciate everybody's kind words, I think we can still do um, much better. Okay, I have one more tool. Yeah, I'm going to make it super quick because it is by far the most boring tool in my entire arsenal, and that is Windows Excel, Microsoft Excel, excuse me. Now, why this matters though is I have an endless number of CSVs, comma separated value files that I use for, here's an example of, there's all the descriptions for ZStats, right? Or um, here's all the tile data, and there's various flags, right? Hey, can a skiff pass through it? There's, if you can imagine, right? This was the first couple of months was just filling this stuff out one by one by one, um, trying to figure it out. Anyway, so I use Microsoft Excel and then I convert them into a JSON format, which is far more readable by a modern programming language like C Sharp. And there you go. So I use Excel. Very boring. Okay, I definitely cannot leave these out of the conversation. Reference materials to start are critical. This is from my Ultima 456 set, and so the Ultima 5 Book of Lore is in here, which is wonderful. Lucky for me, I also have it in digital form on the Ultima Codex. And then this guy, I bought this during my Ultima 6 period where, again, being young as I was, needed a little bit of help. But it's been really excellent too because, it really takes you through. I'm playing my own game without it, but it's nice to have that reference material there as well. And then the handy dandy notebook. I do not take notes that I want to keep. I do not take them digitally. I take all my notes by hand because, frankly, it helps my process. And then I also have in here, there's my Ultima 5 playthrough notes through this playthrough that I'm working on right now. So you can have all this great digital tech, but in the end, I still rely heavily on the analog. So there you go. There's there's the process in general. What I hope to do in the future is I'm going to put together more dev vlogs. I love the number of views I'm getting on the other videos. Showcasing the sort of the latest interesting and neat features that are coming. And I know dev vlogs aren't going to be for everybody, but if you are interested, please do subscribe. I'll be setting up a separate channel for the dev vlogs, so you can follow along that way as well. And then I'll get into more detail because I'd love to be able to break down some of the systems that I've put in place to sort of modernize the Ultima 5 and some of the hiccups that I've got through that process. Maybe some of the reverse engineering practices that I use to, as I sort of mentioned in the save game testing. Maybe some refactoring would be really sharp to show off with the those awesome tools in Rider. Anyway, TBD, I'll let you know. But until then, thanks for listening and go team.